It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Where every week we seek inspiration from great men and women to become the heroes and heroines of our own lives. And you are here with your hosts. I am Andrew Bernstein. You are Robert Begley. How you doing today, Robert?
Unbelievable, Andy. Ready to celebrate a man who pioneered a new musical format called American jazz, whose beaming smile and benevolent outlook on life was as recognizable as the sunshine.
Right.
We are talking about, go ahead.
The great Satchmo, right? Louis
Yes.
Armstrong, the great trumpeter and unique singer, and just a all-around
Yes.
great person who overcame terrible poverty and racism and all kinds of obstacles to become an American
Yes.
icon in the
American icon,
in the
yes.
field of jazz, and I think in music more broadly.
Yeah, so some of the themes we'll talk about are innovators. What are the requirements of innovation? Musicians and entertainers, how could they be heroes to people? And what about this age-old issue of overcoming racism and poverty? And what gives somebody that can-do spirit to overcome that kind of adversity? So those are some of the things we'll talk about today.
Louis Armstrong came first, right? 1901 to 1971. You became universally recognized as the greatest, amongst other accomplishments, as probably the greatest jazz trumpeter of his era and maybe any year.
Of any era. In fact, I was raised Christian, and Gabriel is known for blowing the horn for Judgment Day. And we say, move over, Gabriel, Satchmo is coming when the saints come marching home. And if we liken Andy, one person to one town, New Orleans, a city of wine, woman, and song. And aside from Andrew Jackson winning the Battle of New Orleans, Louis Armstrong, I mean, when they name an airport after you, and even though it was the early part of his life, it had a big impact on who he was. Riding the riverboat up and down performing on the riverboat up and down the Mississippi to Memphis to St. Louis, bringing this new format of music to new audiences.
Louis Armstrong overcame a real hard scrabble life, right? If I remember, his father leaves the family.
Yes.
His mother and the kids are poor. They're in this real rough area of New Orleans known as the Battlefield. Just the name of the neighborhood, tells you.
Right.
The Battlefield, and I think he was pimping for a local prostitute for a while when he was young, just anything to make some bucks. Was arrested for firing a gun in the air.
Shooting a gun on New Year's Eve. Yeah, he's like 11 years old.
Yeah, it was blanks, but still they arrested him and they sent him to the reform school and everything. But he overcame all of this stuff to become one of the most famous musicians of for many years, for like 40 or 50 years, he was just an icon in American music and entertainment.
When I think of Louis Armstrong, that smile, with the big white teeth, no matter what. I mean, the fact that you can maintain this kind of benevolence in the face of this kind of opposition and really enjoy your life. And he says, I worked hard. People ask him, is this work for you? He says, I love what I'm doing. So it's not exactly work, but I do it. He practiced, certainly as a kid, learned his chops, developed different styles of musical innovation, had incredible timing. Some of his innovation, scat singing, which is where you're not even saying words, you're just going along with the melody and just bop it deep, bop up, do up, that kind of stuff like that had never been done before. And this is off the top of his head. He's just got this musical ability to just jump in and make something out of nothing. One of the things we want to talk about, how come entertainers can be heroes? Think of all the kids who see this kind of guy, whether they're black or white or Jewish. We'll talk about his, background with the family that really helped him out. So he sees this kind of racism, but he's like, no, I'm looking for the good. So the racism that he experienced, he was like, that's not everybody.
Louis Armstrong just had this, even in the face of all of this opposition and racial hatreds and everything, you're right. He just exuded this genuine, sincere goodwill. It's just poured out of him. And in what a wonderful world, here he's focused on all the good things in the world. And despite all the evils, there are a lot of good things. And Louis Armstrong, in effect, telling us, yes, there's a lot of bad things in the world, but there's a lot of good people too. They do a lot of good things. There's a lot of people reach great achievements in music and the arts, and science, and literature, and business, all kinds of fields. It's important to fight against the evil, but it's more important to reward the good. And Louis Armstrong rewarding the good, wonderful world. Like my sister said, there's a smile in his voice.
So Andy, I want to share one story in my life. So I grew up, both my parents loved jazz, so it was always on in the house when we were children and even young adults. And I'm 26 years old. One of my, to this day, top achievements in life, I buy an apartment in New York City. And I'm so proud of myself. And my mother's going to be in the city for an event, and I invite her over. I want to share this experience with her because she was tough. I might have mentioned this before. She was really tough to impress, and of course, that would make me try to work harder to try to impress her more. So this is my top achievement. I invite her to my apartment, and I put it on the jazz station, quiet in the background, and the song comes on. What a Wonderful World, and she just says, "Oh, Louis," and I'm like, that was like the height of an experience that we could have where music is integrated into this celebration. And now I can't hear that song without thinking of my mother. And I usually burst into tears without even, without being ready for it. So again, how a song impacts us throughout our life. You have different, music is so associational, Andy. And again, sounds that Louis Armstrong's, whether it's him blowing the trumpet or this gravelly, beautiful soul in his voice. I mean, here's where, you don't have the gift of a beautiful Ella Fitzgerald or an Elvis Presley vocal range, but it comes out of his soul, and it's so obvious. And that's just one aspect of how a song can impact somebody, and certainly has in my life.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe we should talk about the different forms of racism that Louis Armstrong overcame. He comes from the South. New Orleans probably I'm guessing it was probably more integrated and less segregated than many parts of the South, right?
It was a shipping place. It was only known, before Louis Armstrong, it was only a shipping port for goods coming from the Mississippi to the Gulf, and then out across other locations. So nobody knows really New Orleans that much before Armstrong.
Okay, so then New Orleans wasn't any better than any place else in the South then regarding segregation.
No, I'm sorry. One other thing, Andy, it's French. It actually had a French Creole background, so it was slightly different from the more Anglo-American, traditional Anglo-Saxon other states, and it maintained that. Even the New Orleans is from Orleans,
and the French Quarter,
right?
The French Quarter,
exactly, the French Quarter. So in that sense, perhaps there was less, more integration, but they also had the voodoo. They had a lot of these, a lot of these primitive, the primitive influences as well.
So Louis Armstrong, witnesses the anti-Black racism. It doesn't witness it. It's
experiences
born out again. Experiences born out, on his hide, but also the anti-Semitism, because he had very, very good relations as a young child with a poor Jewish family there. What were their name? The Karnofskis? I think they were Lithuanian Jews.
That's right. Yes.
Very touching story. You want to tell a story of the
well, they took him in. They actually took him in. He did some work for pay for them. But he witnessed, this is the witness part, Andy. He saw how these Jews were racially attacked, and he, he was stunned, he's stunned because here are people the same color, as other
Yeah.
people, but they are attacked, in many ways, viciously, just because of their, nationality / religion. And he would, as we mentioned earlier, he wore the Star of David for the rest of his life, but
Yeah.
he made an income, and they gave him money to buy his first cornet.
That's right.
They
right,
saw his
right.
musical talent, and they were like, here's some money. And he's like, I can't afford this. I can't take this. And sure enough, they saw an ability in him. And this is another thing that's helpful, in a person's life, life changing. And when someone believes in you, okay, no matter, and they look past your race, okay, he complete, he had allegiance to them for the rest of his life. One
Right.
other thing, Andy, I'll say real fast, is that something people don't know about, and I'll put the link to it. He was very introspective. What he did from the 1940s on, he would record himself just speaking about current events, about things. So he had the persona of this, incredibly benevolent man. And then he also recorded some of his thoughts, and which were not as well known, but the racism that he experienced and even saw with the Karnofskys were, they're in there about that. So he was a thinker. He was a thinker as well as an incredible entertainer.
Right. And his view of religion sounded very ecumenical, because when asked what religion he was, he said, I'm a Baptist, but I think he was baptized as a Catholic at some point in his life, wasn't he? Or at least
I think so. But
at least there's some stories. There's some stories to that effect. And he wore
wore
the Star of David his whole life in honor of the Karnofsky family.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And yeah,
something about the man. I'll just say this real fast. There's a lot of things that are fact, and there's some things that are fiction.
Right.
And for decades, he said he was born on July 4th, 1900. Okay, but data has come out later saying like August 4th, 1901.
1901.
But he just played up this image, of being an American. And so here's where the embellishment part. We want to get our facts right, but we're also looking at a man who doesn't let a good story get facts get in the way of a good story.
Exactly. He created a persona. His life is legendary. This is it's like in some aspects are a tall tale. And so, that's a nice line, by the way. You never let the facts get in the way of a good story. That's absolutely right. I just want to go back to
Carrie always does that when I'm telling the story. She'll interrupt me to correct a fact, and I'll shoot her a look. I'm like, right. I got the stage here, right? Correct me later.
There are many contexts in which the story is more important than the facts. And then, and Louis Armstrong was a legendary figure. I just want to say one other thing about racism here that Louis Armstrong experienced, witnessed, and overcame, is that the Jew hatred in America was never at the same magnitude as in Europe, but it was real, and it existed in in the United States, maybe to some extent even still does. But when you talk about racism being pandemic around the world, the Jew hatred in Europe for centuries was just the pogroms, and then the Nazis and the ghettos and everything. So this kind of irrationality is worldwide in different forms, directed against different ethnic groups. But Louis Armstrong overcame it. He just overcame it. It's a real great story about him and the Karnofsky family. The way they the way they bond is very touching. It shows the good that human beings can accomplish, and what he's singing about in What a Wonderful World. Singing about soulfully coming from his soul.
Yes. I'll say, Andy, so just wrapping up this segment, the last point I want to talk about is the influence of jazz as a new format of music. It came out of the blues and some ragtime. So these are American musical innovations that don't exist in Europe and in the Far East. They're like completely American. And part of that is this longing for a better life, because much of it is, coming out of the, whether it's slavery, just out of the hardships that they experienced. And as I said earlier, some of the jazz innovations, improvisation, solos, and Louis Armstrong was like he was top-notch soloist. Like that was his thing. I won't play second trumpet. His second wife said that to him, and that's why he went out on his own in the 1920s. And but a different kind of music that didn't, that to this day is clearly influential, jazz music. So I just want to say something about him being a pioneer and how innovators, they exist across the board in all different kinds of human endeavor. So just a little word there.
Yeah,
about,
let me interject here about
Mhm.
innovators, because one of
Yeah.
my favorite songs
Yes.
that
Yes.
the duets that he
Yeah.
did with the great Ella
Mhm.
Fitzgerald was They All Laughed. They all laughed at Christopher Columbus. They told Marconi wireless was a phony. It was a great line. They honor all of these innovative thinkers, not just
Yeah.
Columbus and Marconi, but Edison and the Wright
Yes.
brothers and Henry Ford, even Milton Hershey and the Hershey bar.
Yeah, amazing.
That people scoffed very on the Wright brothers and flight. The people often scoffed at these innovative ideas,
Mhm.
and it's the song honors. First of all, it's a great song, and
Yeah.
anytime you have Louis Armstrong teaming up with Ella Fitzgerald, it's going to be great. It's a great song,
Mhm.
but also it really compliments and praises these great innovative thinkers who overcame all kinds of obstacles. And Louis Armstrong himself, like you said, was just a brilliant innovator in the field of popular
Yeah.
music.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, so station break here. We are watching The Hero Show, brought to you by Objective Standard Institute. You can check out our site, objectivestandard.org. We have courses coming up. I think Andy's going to be part of our upcoming course on Ayn Rand's integrations. And please like and share this program and our other podcasts that we have. So back to Louis, and I want to mention my friend Nelson, one of our donors had requested Louis Armstrong. And so thank you, Nelson.
Nelson, this
I was
one's
looking for an
you.
excuse. Yeah. And
This
many
one's for
others,
you.
because right, exactly.
And of course,
Yeah.
Nelson,
Mhm.
you're absolutely right. Louis Armstrong certainly deserves
Yes.
his own episode on the Hero Show.
Yeah, so let's go a little bit on his timeline, Andy. We mentioned early in life. We talked about that. Born August 1904, and then
1901, wasn't it? Let's get the facts.
I'm sorry, yeah, August 4th, 1901. Thank you for keeping me. So
I had to keep up Carrie Ann's spirit here, right? Keep you tied to reality.
She'll love to hear that. Yeah. So one of his first jazz influencers, Joe Oliver, he's playing in Joe Oliver's band. This is on the riverboats that go up to Memphis, they go up to St. Louis, and eventually Joe Oliver goes north and to Chicago. So we think of these great musical towns, Andy: New Orleans, Memphis, Chicago, St. Louis. And Armstrong is like one of the first ones there, and each one making his mark. And over time, then he goes to New York. Okay, he's done at one point. So he married. By the way, Louis Armstrong married 4 times, and he always said, really, music is my wife. That's the one consistency. But his second wife, she's the one that said, don't play second fiddle to Joe Oliver, go out on your own. And here's a risk, because he's making a decent income in Chicago, but he strikes out on his own in New York and becomes a sensation because he does these solos and people come just to see him. The Cotton Club, maybe the racism isn't that much better in New York, where he's playing only white audiences. But then he
was a big part. He was a big part of the Harlem Renaissance, right?
Big part of the
Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. I think the writer Langston Hughes was a big fan and admirer of Louis Armstrong.
That's right. Played, it was called the Hot Chocolates. That was one of his bands. I know, right? Ain't Misbehaving.
You can't say that stuff today. I mean, you couldn't name your band the Hot Chocolates today.
So, and by the way, when he's in Chicago, he meets Al Capone. He gets caught up in the whole gangster.
That reminds me, Robin. When he was playing in Harlem, one of the clubs he played at was a rival to the Cotton Club. I forget the name of it. offhand, but it was a front for Dutch Schultz, who was,
Dutch Schultz as well.
notorious New York gangster.
He didn't discriminate. He had Italian mobsters, he had Jewish mobsters.
Right.
And also so if we could talk about the integration and so one of the beautiful things about Armstrong was that when he was wealthy enough to have his own bands, he always had an integration. Okay, he said white people can play jazz just as good as black people. It's a matter of what you have in your soul as an individual. So here's his individual.
Yeah, I know he was friends with Hoagie Carmichael, right? And
that's right. Yeah,
and a number of white, musicians and composers. Yeah.
So he's moving on. He's moving on through his gaining popularity in the 20s and 30s, and then we get to the 40s, and he's like. First of all, once you see him on a screen, now we're the era of the television. Initially, you could hear him and you know what he sounds like. But then when you see him and this, this vibrancy and this joy that comes out of him, he's as recognizable as anybody else, in entertainment. And he moves to Corona, New York, which is where he lived the rest of his life, Queens, right near Shea Stadium one of the tennis courts actually for the U.S. Open, similarly named.
It was an interesting choice. Somebody of his wealth and fame, you would think, would live, in the heart of the city and somewhere in, on Central Park West, or some place like that. But maybe in Queens, he felt he had more privacy. I don't know. I'm not sure.
More privacy, working class. He was not an ostentatious man. He liked the benefits of being wealthy, but he wasn't necessarily ostentatious. And I've been to it's now a museum in Corona, Queens, the Louis Armstrong Museum. And it's a modest place, but imagine this, Andy, imagine you're a kid in Corona and you walk by and the window's open. And this legend is practicing. He's practicing the trumpet, like you have access to a concert, every day.
That's right.
I mean, that's just amazing, and
that is your next door neighbor is Louis Armstrong. He's leaving town. He said, hey kid, Ted, the young kid next door, can you watch the dogs, for me for a week? I'll pay you X amount of dollars to take care of my cat or my dog or whatever. It's just fascinating that he lived in, like you said, in this working class neighborhood in Queens and just kind of fit in. He was not a prima donna. He was just a really good hearted, good natured individual human being.
Yeah. I want to say one other story, just coming back to the how he handles racism. He's in Pearl Harbor. Okay. For some reason he's over there. Right. And a guy walks up to him and says, well, I don't like Negroes. Okay. And Louis like, well, I admire your sincerity. Okay. And the guy goes, I don't like Negroes, but I'm crazy about you. All right. So, you could stop the dialogue halfway and just have one conclusion that's very unfortunate, but it ends on a bit of a high note. And of course, if you like Louis Armstrong, you're going now beyond race. You're going by the character and with the value that this man gives in your life. And then if you continue that line of thinking and emotion consistently, then race won't be an issue anymore. So
it's interesting. What's the rational way to handle this kind of vicious irrationality? Because it'd be just to be angry, at such irrationality and tell this guy to go bleep off. But at the same time, some people recognize I'm an ambassador, and if I live a life of dignity, I might be able to reach people who are often mixed. Even racists are often mixed. They may have some goodness in their soul. I might be able to reach that. And Louis Armstrong maybe was able to reach this guy and maybe check his premises. Why do I hate blacks? This guy's such a great person, not just a musical talent. He's such a great person. Maybe I need to rethink my upbringing.
Yes.
of hating blacks. And that reminds me, Robert, because
Daryl
the other day,
Davis, the hero show you did with Daryl Davis and Andy, you and
yeah,
John, that is exactly that topic right there. But I go ahead, I interrupted.
yeah,
Sorry.
Daryl Davis is an amazing story. Anybody go back and check that out on the Hero Show.
Mhm.
Because Daryl Davis, a Black American musician, contemporary, who reaches out to Klan members who some of whom are violent and would kill him, and yet he's able to convert these guys very often,
Yeah.
away from
Yep.
racism and out of the Klan. He's got like 200 hoods and robes in his personal closet. So yeah, Daryl Davis is a real hero. Anyhow, so just the other day they brought back the film In the Heat of the Night as a special event at the local movie.
Yeah.
Great movie with great
Absolutely,
acting.
yeah.
Rod Steiger, Sidney Poitier. It's just
Yeah.
outstanding. They what do they call you up there in Philadelphia? They asked, Sidney Poitier. They call me Mr. Tibbs.
Mr. Tibbs.
But,
Which became the title of the sequel, right? That was the
Right,
sequel.
right.
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and he's this brilliant homicide investigator, but he's a really upright, morally upright person who conducts himself with great dignity in the face of this racism. And as an ambassador, I mean, he wins to try to phrase hearts and minds and souls. And the Rod Steiger character gives a great performance, by the way.
Yeah.
But he's this racist sheriff in Mississippi, and not everybody in Mississippi was a racist, any more than not everybody in Europe was a Jew hater. There are good people wherever you go, but unfortunately, there's a lot of racists. And by the end of the movie, the racist sheriff is carrying the black homicide investigator's bags to the train. There's such respect for him, and some people can overcome that in their souls, and then they become like an ambassador. And reach the good, because the Rod Steiger character in The Heat of the Night was a racist, but he was also an honest cop, and he recognized good police work, and it could cause you reach the good in people. It could cause them perhaps to rethink their upbringing and their racist assumptions. And so I think Louis Armstrong was a perfect example of what a great story that is, that you just told, the Pearl Harbor story. He was an ambassador, and he was an ambassador, he reached people, maybe got them to challenge their own racist assumptions, like that one guy you just mentioned.
But he also paid a price, because the more active, the up and coming generations of Black jazz musicians, whether Dizzy Gillespie and others, criticized him.
Yeah, Miles Davis, Charlie Parker.
Because Armstrong had a platform and he didn't use it for political purposes. But guess what? And he was called an Uncle Tom. Guess what? Anytime somebody's called an Uncle Tom, I almost want to reach out and shake their hand, because I know what they're going through. They're just being tagged and dismissed for trying to do benevolent things. Often, I can't say that every single time, but Louis Armstrong was above that. He was like, no, this is like you just said. He didn't call himself an ambassador of goodwill, but that's what he personified.
Yeah, right.
And that's here's a division of labor. That's somebody else's issue, somebody else's battle to fight. Here's a guy who fought this battle from day one in experience. So he doesn't have to go out with, I'd rather be in the suburbs of New York City and live this quiet life and go out on the road when necessary and be the person that everybody loves when I'm up on stage. And that's, I applaud him for that aspect.
Yeah, and there's different, when you're the honest, innocent victim, and millions of Black Americans are innocent victims, you have a choice here, of how you can respond, and you have every right to be, to speak out against the injustice, and say, there's a lot of great things about America, but this is wrong. America's got to live up to its own ideals and everything, and you could use your fame, or however much you have, even just in your personal life, if you're not famous, speak out to people. You could, you have the choice to do that. That is one honest form of standing up to injustice. But you also have the choice of just being this enormously benevolent person, this really good human being, who, like you said, that's a nice phrase, ambassador of goodwill, and showing people just in the way you conduct yourself, what a good man looks like, regardless of how much pigmentation he has in his skin. And people are often mixed, including racist. There may be some good in them. Very often there is. And the ambassador of goodwill, touches that part of their soul, and it can make them reflect on their own irrational assumptions. And wait a minute, maybe my upbringing here was wrong. Maybe I was wrong to think that blacks are bad people, they're inferior, or whatever. Maybe I was wrong about that. Ambassadors of goodwill have a real place in human life, and Louis Armstrong's a perfect example of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I totally agree. So let's cover a couple of other songs, a little bit more of his music, Andy, before we wind this down. Some of the tracks that really have spoken to me throughout the arc of my life. You mentioned Ella Fitzgerald, and my favorite of their duets together, "It Ain't Necessarily So," from Porgy and Bess, Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. For me, when I was raised as a Catholic and believing these stories about, Jonah lived in a well, and the way Louis sings that, he lived in that fish abdomen. What is he say? It's like,
Right.
it ain't necessarily so. The things in the Bible, are liable, the things in the Bible, you're liable to believe. It's just, it might not necessarily be so. And that's one of my hallmark, that I share with people on what he's saying. But Mac the Knife, even before Bobby Darin turned that into a #1 song, Louis Armstrong sang that. We mentioned Hello Dolly and What a Wonderful World. Got the heebie-jeebies when he was in his 20s.
Yeah.
That was the first, that was the first scat singing song, and it's really what put the song that put him on the map. So there's instrumentalist pieces that he does that, your heart is like, wow, what a sound, that landscape, that even when he's not singing, it's just, this what's coming out of the speakers. It's just like, for me personally, again, growing up on his kind of music, it's just enriched my life in so many ways. But anything any other songs, Andy, that speak to you that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, just what I've already touched on. They all laughed. It's again,
yes,
great duet with
Mm-hmm.
Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. It's a great song in and of itself. It honors all of these inventors and independent thinkers. So I know we mentioned Ayn Rand on this show. We're both big Ayn Rand fans. Anybody out there? The the Russian immigrant to America, right? Novelist, philosopher, exactly right. If you guys out there haven't read her great novel, The Fountainhead, I strongly urge you to read it. It's my
about innovators,
and the way The Fountainhead honors these independent thinkers who stand up against social pressure. They refuse to conform. They think autonomously. They have new ideas. They often revolutionize different fields. Ayn Rand herself revolutionized our understanding, I think, of both literature and philosophy. But the song, They All Laugh, really captures the essence of it. People often scoff at things they've never seen before. The Wright brothers think they're going to fly. I mean, you're going to get killed. I'm not going up. I'm never going up in a plane. We're going to die.
Right.
There's still people. Right. There's still people who'd rather drive from Boston to Los Angeles or whatever, rather than fly. But the innovative thinkers overcame that to an enormous degree, carry us out of the caves and into modern civilization. And the song, in a great song, they honor that spirit. So that's one of the reasons I love They All Laughed. And
I'll put the link to that. Yep. In the notes.
Definitely. But any duet with Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, I mean, I'll just sit there with my mouth open and just listen to it, and just kind of savor it.
Yeah. So one thing about Louis Armstrong, as he was aging and his health was starting to fail, he still kept up with the times. As we said, 1967 is What a Wonderful World. So he's 66 years old when this comes out. Only 4 more years left in his life. But he says, I like the Beatles. I liked this kind of, he actually didn't like some of the bebop. He didn't necessarily like, another thing I love about the man, he didn't like the bebop jazz era. Part of it was the personalities and the drug use. He was totally against that, and seeing these musicians die, and Charlie Parker's died due to drug overdoses. And again, that's not a wonderful life. And it's like, if you think you're like dying for the cause of this, strict music, Louis Armstrong doesn't speak that language, and he makes it, he makes it clear Now I'm not saying he didn't do anything with his
Yeah, well,
health.
he
You know,
himself was a big marijuana user, right? But
yes, yes,
marijuana is similar to alcohol in a way that it's
yeah,
relatively innocuous. It's not heroin, or the later
no,
drugs like
that's
crack,
right.
things like that.
Th- that's
Uh,
right.
so he wasn't using what they call the hard stuff that is
No.
so toxic: cocaine, heroin.
And it's so
Later on
tied
crack.
into and is so tied into the jazz, if we talk about Ray Charles, the jazz era where they're sticking, needles in their
Yeah.
arms. And it's like, no. So Louis Armstrong rejects that. And he's like, no, I want, if I'll smoke my pot and leave me alone. And he had all these pills lined up. Some of the stories about him is that he's like, they're all going to end up in the same place, And one time, actually, Dizzy Gillespie, I think, tells the story that he saw Louis like backstage, and he's got these things wrapped around his legs, and he's like, what are those? And he goes, they're helping with my very close veins. One other time, Andy, I got to say this. So he talking about relationships, I think it was the producer. He was supposed to be recording only with one label, and somewhat early in his career, when he's taking a risk, he goes to New York and he's striking out on his own. And the producer finds out that he's recorded with another label, and that's like a no-no.
Right.
And he tells him, Louis, you can't be doing this, you got to come clean. And Louis Armstrong says, I did not do it, and I will never do it again. What is your answer to that, Andy? When someone tells you,
no, that reminds me of Yogi, the baseball philosopher and sage Yogi Berra, who said about some nightclub in New York City, might have been the Copa, I don't remember. He said,
right.
He said it's so crowded, nobody goes there anymore.
Nobody goes there anymore. Yeah. But I mean, I did not do it, and I'll never do it again.
No, that's a great line. That's a great line.
So the man just towered above above the commonplace. He was in the spotlight for the better part of his life, acted in this dignified way. Andy, 30 movies he made. We have now up to this point only talked about his musical career. 30 movies, High Society, Hello Dolly.
Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, right?
Yes.
In High Society. I mean, so this is these are big stars,
And this is crossing over once again,
right.
Integrating races. This man was about integration, living a life of integration and individualism in an era where they just want to pigeonhole you collectivistically, that your race determines what you are. And Armstrong, his last days, his last couple of years, died in 1971. I remember I was a kid. It was like in New York City was gloomy after hearing the news. They had some incredible ceremonies about him. 60 Minutes had reports on him, and all these things were dug out. All these musicians came, and this outpouring, to even the ones Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis, they pulled back on their criticism. They grew up, in effect, to say, no, this guy's a giant. There's no note you can hear on the trumpet that he has not played.
And look, we can just be honest, right? Look, I disagree with Louis Armstrong and this, that, the other thing on his political stance or whatever. Yeah. But in the field of music, he's a giant. He's an innovator, he's a path breaker. Yes. Many of us were able to follow, and be commercially successful in some part thanks to Louis Armstrong. It's like in baseball. You may disagree with what Jackie Robinson said or did on various. Maybe he was a Republican, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of the players that followed may have been Democrats or whatever. But so we can disagree with Jackie Robinson on this, that, the other thing. But he was a trailblazer, and we honor him and what he put up with. What he dealt with. Again, an ambassador of goodwill, a real giant. Yeah. And we honored him on the Hero Show. So you better be honest. You could criticize the guy. You disagree with him on his philosophy, his religion, his ethics, his politics, whatever. But his accomplishments, what's the Latin expression? Res ipsa loquitur, right? The thing speaks for itself. And you honor that. And I think that's a good place. I think that's a good place to wind up, Rob. Honor.
Closing note, Andy, he says, I think I lived a beautiful life. Okay. That's we got is that word saluting?
Yes,
is that word saluting?
That is definitely word saluting. We got to honor the great man. Thank you, Satchmo.